I don't often share personal stories like this, but lately, I've been reflecting a lot on the past. What happened when I was 6 still lingers in my mind, and it's a chapter one don't usually revisit. But here I am, telling it, because I've realized there's a lot to unpack. It all began when I was 6. My parents told me that I would be staying with my grandparents for a while. At the time, it sounded exciting. I loved visiting them. Gran always had fresh cookies waiting for me, and she'd let me watch cartoons long past my bedtime. Grandpa and I would spend hours in the garden picking tomatoes, even though I hated them. I didn't mind, though. I loved being with him. But that day was different. Something about it felt off. My mom was quieter than usual, and when she hugged me goodbye, it was stiff, like she was holding something back. Dad seemed in a rush. He barely even came inside the house before he left. He just waved from the driveway as he drove off. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was young and excited to be at my grandparents' house. I didn't see the bigger picture. I didn't know that would be the last time I saw my parents for years. At first, I kept asking Gran when they'd come back. She always smiled and said, "Soon, sweetheart." I think she truly believed that. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, her answers became less certain. She would smile at me, but it was tinged with sadness, and sometimes she'd avoid the question altogether. Grandpa, who was always so cheerful, became quieter. Whenever my parents were mentioned, I'd catch him muttering under his breath, shaking his head. It wasn't until my uncle, my dad's younger brother, sat me down that I learned the truth. He was blunt, never one to sugarcoat things. I remember sitting with him on the swing set in the backyard, the sky turning pink as the sun set. He looked at me seriously and said, "They think it's best for you to stay here for a while." I didn't understand. I asked him why. Why wasn't I going home? Why wasn't my family coming back for me? He gently explained, though it still didn't make sense to my 6-year-old mind, that my sister was sick. My parents needed to focus on her, and they couldn't take care of both of us. I didn't know how to process it. Why couldn't they care for both me and her? Why couldn't I go back home? That night, I cried harder than I ever had before. Gran sat with me on the couch, gently rocking me back and forth like a baby. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She just held me while I cried, and that's when it hit me. They weren't coming back for me. Life with Gran and Grandpa wasn't bad. They were kind and loving, doing their best to make me feel safe. But they were older. Taking care of a young child full-time was too much for them. They were tired, and it became clear that they couldn't manage alone. That's when my uncle and his wife stepped in. My uncle began helping out with repairs around the house and took me out for ice cream when I was feeling down. But it wasn't enough. My grandparents were too tired, too overwhelmed. My uncle and aunt offered to take me in, and after many heartfelt conversations, it was decided that I would live with them. I didn't want to leave Gran and Grandpa, but they reassured me that it was for the best. "You'll still see us all the time," Gran promised, and she was right. They lived just a few blocks away, and I saw them nearly every day. Living with my uncle and aunt was an adjustment. They were younger and more energetic than my grandparents, which meant life moved faster. Bedtimes were enforced, and there was more structure. But there was also more room for fun. My uncle played catch with me in the yard, and my aunt baked cookies, letting me decorate them, even though I was terrible at it. By the time I was 8, I began calling them Mom and Dad. It wasn't planned. It just happened. They never asked me to. I didn't even think about it at the time, but now I understand why it felt so right. They were the ones who tucked me into bed at night, helped me with my homework, and cheered me on at school events. Meanwhile, my biological parents were like ghosts. I called them sometimes, but they wouldn't pick up. I wrote letters, telling them all about school, how I had gotten a gold star on a spelling test or learned about dinosaurs. I thought those little things would make them proud, but they never wrote back. When I was about 9, my parents visited me. I don't know why they came. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe they thought they were supposed to. Whatever the reason, the visit was awkward. They didn't know how to talk to me, and I didn't know what to say to them either. My mom brought me a cheap toy truck, and my dad asked awkward, surface-level questions like, "So, how's school?" It was painfully clear that they didn't really know me anymore. When they left after less than an hour, my uncle pulled me into a hug. "You don't need to worry about them, okay?" he said. That was the moment I realized I wasn't worried anymore. I had a new family now, and they were the ones who truly cared. That's when it truly hit me. My uncle and aunt were my real parents. My biological parents may have brought me into this world, but they weren't the ones raising me. By the time I was 9, I had stopped asking about them. It wasn't that I didn't care, I did. After all, they were my parents. But every time I asked about them, it led nowhere. My grandparents would grow silent when their names came up, and while my uncle and aunt tried to remain neutral, I could sense their frustration with the whole situation. Eventually, I grew tired of the empty answers. I sent letters and waited eagerly by the mailbox, hoping they would write back. They never did. When I was 10, my uncle gave me an old flip phone. It wasn't anything special, just the basics, calling and texting, but to me, it felt like a symbol of growing up. I used to call my parents, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'd answer now that their big boy's son was calling. They didn't. Not once. Sometimes I left voicemails, but they never called back. One day, I even asked Gran if maybe they had lost my number or forgotten where we lived. She gave me a sad smile and said, "Sweetheart, they know how to find you if they want to." That hit me hard. The idea that they could reach out whenever they wanted but chose not to, it was a tough pill to swallow. The breaking point came when I was 11. My parents visited for the first time in years. I was excited, too excited. I cleaned my room, brushed my hair, and even wore a button-up shirt my aunt had picked out for me, the one she said made me look handsome. But when they arrived, it was like they barely knew me. They acted more like distant relatives who were meeting me for the first time than the parents who should have known me inside out. My mom brought another generic toy, and my dad asked the same boring questions. How's school? It was painfully clear they didn't know me at all. I wanted to scream, "I'm your son. Why don't you know me?" But I didn't. I just gave them short answers until they left. When they finally left, I told my uncle that I didn't want to see them anymore. He didn't push me. "That's your choice, buddy," he said. "We'll support you no matter what." From that point on, the silence between me and my biological parents became mutual. I stopped calling, stopped writing, and they didn't seem to notice. By the time I was 12, I was done waiting for them to care. If they wanted me in their lives, they'd have to prove it. What made it easier to let go of them was the way my aunt and uncle stepped up. They didn't just take me in. They parented me in every sense of the word. My uncle went to every single parent-teacher conference, even the ones where the teacher just said, "He's doing fine." My aunt stayed up late helping me with school projects, even when I procrastinated until the last minute. One summer, they even took me to Disneyland. At the time, I didn't realize how much they must have saved to make that trip happen. We weren't rich, but they wanted me to have those experiences. My uncle, who hated roller coasters, even rode Space Mountain with me because he didn't want me to go alone. That's the kind of people they were. Meanwhile, my biological parents were like ghosts. I didn't hear from them at all after their awkward visit when I was 11. Gran would occasionally mention them. "Your mom asked how you were doing," but it always felt hollow. If she cared, why didn't she just ask me directly? The last real update I got about them came when my sister's condition worsened. Gran told me they had moved closer to a hospital that specialized in her illness. I felt bad for my sister. None of this was her fault, but I couldn't help but feel resentment too. They uprooted their entire lives for her, but they couldn't even pick up the phone to check on me. I tried not to let it bother me. My life with my aunt and uncle was stable and full of love. They gave me everything I needed, even when I didn't realize it. By the time I was a teenager, I had come to terms with the fact that my biological parents weren't really my parents anymore, not in the ways that mattered. One day, out of the blue, my uncle sat me down. "You know you're wanted, right?" he said, looking me in the eyes. "You're not just here because we had to take you in. We wanted you." I didn't cry in front of him. Teenage boys don't cry, right? But later that night I did. That was the moment I stopped seeing myself as the kid my parents left behind and started thinking of myself as the kid my aunt and uncle chose. By the time I was 14, my life with my aunt and uncle felt like the most normal thing in the world. They never made me feel like a burden. If anything, they treated me like I was the best thing that had ever happened to them. One day, I overheard my aunt talking to Gran. "We've never been able to have kids," she said quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "We tried everything, but it just wasn't meant to be." I had no idea. They'd never talked about it before. But as I listened, it all clicked. The way they poured so much love and energy into raising me wasn't just because they were good people. It was because they genuinely wanted to be parents. Around that time, they started talking about adoption. My uncle casually brought it up one night after dinner. "How would you feel if we made this official?" he asked. At first, I wasn't sure what to say. They already felt like my parents in every way that mattered. Would a piece of paper really change anything? But the more we talked about it, the more I realized how much it meant to them. It wasn't just about legality. It was about belonging. The process wasn't easy. My biological parents still had legal rights, even though they had essentially abandoned me. There were court dates, lawyers, and mountains of paperwork. But my aunt and uncle were determined to make it happen. The adoption became official when I turned 18. I'll never forget sitting in that courtroom as the judge declared them my legal parents. It felt surreal. My uncle hugged me afterward, tears in his eyes, and said, "We've always been your family. This just makes it official." That night, we celebrated with pizza. Nothing fancy, but it felt perfect. My aunt kept calling me her miracle kid, and my uncle joked, "You were just misrouted by the stork at first, but we found you." That day, everything changed for me. It erased any lingering doubt about where I truly belonged. My biological parents' rejection no longer defined me. After the adoption, I started calling my aunt and uncle mom and dad full time. It wasn't something we discussed. It just happened. And I'll never forget the look on my aunt's face the first time I said, "Thanks, Mom." Her face lit up like the sun had come out. And in that moment, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be.